Okay, hello everyone. I'm Alessa. I'm the president of the PsychSoc, and today we're looking at something pretty cool and very relevant after the COVID pandemic. How do we prevent misinformation, and what can we do to lower the rates of misinformation and the spread of false information? So today we have Dr. Sander van der Linden, and he's coming to talk to us about that. So I'll give you the floor.
Thanks very much. Are you all PBS students?
I'm not.
I'm not? No? Okay, that's a good mix, just checking. So there won't be too much overlap with the PBS sort of lectures. I usually kind of start with illustrating some of the effects of misinformation. I guess perhaps with you guys there's no need to do that, but I've studied people who set phone masts on fire in the UK because they thought that 5G was exacerbating the coronavirus. It's really sad, actually. Some people really believe this because they read it in WhatsApp groups and they research it online and they become really convinced and they set out and just vandalize stuff. In Iran, hundreds of people have died because they've ingested methanol because they thought it was going to cleanse them from the coronavirus, including children. So it's really severe, and it's not just here, in the West. In the U.S., one of my favorite ones is the, vaccines will change your DNA misinformation sort of story. Here in the UK, one of my favorite ones is the disappearing needle. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but this is a video, and they show you that when you get the vaccine, the needle disappears. So it's a fake vaccine. And so this was making the rounds during the pandemic. And then, of course, lately we have a huge amount of disinformation about the Ukraine-Russian war. So this was a Facebook video that went viral saying that there was a military convoy heading to Ukraine. In fact, this is California, and so it's just put out of context entirely. We have Putin releasing lots of disinformation about the war, obviously. In the US, a QAnon believer shoved a sword through his brother's head because he thought he was a shape-shifting lizard. And so this is part of the QAnon reptilian conspiracy theory. And then, of course, we have the Capitol riots in the US. So plenty of examples of why we're worrying about the impacts of misinformation. Now, maybe this is not, when you study this topic, in order to identify misinformation, what most people do is they kind of look at fact-checked articles. So we give people a series of fact-checked articles and ask if they believe them or not. That's one approach. The other is to look at the source. So there are known publishers of dodgy content because they're rated as untrustworthy. But the approach that we take in our lab is actually not one of these, but the idea that there's these misinformation techniques out there used to produce misinformation, and that we can help people calibrate their judgments in terms of whether they can spot these techniques. And the reason for that is because this actually constitutes a very small amount of misinformation. So, the amount of people who believe in flat Earth or stuff that's obviously totally fake is actually very small, whereas the percentage of misleading content that's out there that leverages some grain of truth but is actually using a technique to influence us is very prevalent. So here's an example. So this is vitamin C protects against coronavirus, which is obviously false. You can see that it's false because this is a dodgy source. This is not a credible website. It's also been fact-checked. So this is the sort of obvious fake news. But then look at this. So healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating why. So the Chicago Tribune in the States is a very reputable outlet. So from the source, you wouldn't be able to say that this is fake. In terms of the facts, this did happen. So technically it's not false. But clearly a technique here is used to frame this information in a way to get people riled up about the vaccine, right? It's suggesting a causal link between the doctor and the vaccine, even though there was no evidence to substantiate such a link. And so this actually went viral on Facebook. It was the most shared article in the first quarter of 2021 on Facebook. So this is the type of stuff that we're more concerned about, that's more subtle and manipulative rather than just plain false. So that's kind of just the background. So when I say misinformation, I mean stuff that's false, disinformation, misinformation with actually a psychological intention to harm or deceive other people, and then propaganda is disinformation with the political agenda. So we all use the term fake news for almost everything these days, but I really focused on this area of disinformation because everyone makes mistakes, and that technically is misinformation, but perhaps not as concerning. So if you look at what people are doing, governments, international organizations, fact-checking and verification are one of the primary tools that people have been using. And all of our research on this, especially from cognitive science, illustrates why that's not so effective. I mean, I think fact-checking is good, and it's important to get facts out there, but it's just limited because of a number of important psychological mechanisms. So one of the most important ones is what we call the continued influence of misinformation. So what you typically see is that once people are exposed to misinformation, it continues to influence our memories and our reasoning about the issue. And the reason for that is because when you integrate something in your memory network, right, it makes friends with other things that you know semantically. So once you think that something is true, it becomes part of your knowledge, which links to all the other things that you know. And then it's just a game of whack-a-mole trying to correct something. So you can try to inactivate one link, but then 20 others are still active. So that's why it's really difficult to correct things after people have already been exposed to it. And on top of that, some people don't like to be corrected, right? And so you get social resistance because people don't like the idea that they're being told what they need to believe. So neurologically, it's not entirely clear why this happens. So there's two competing explanations about the neural mechanisms here. The first is sometimes what we call the selective retrieval account, and the other is called the integration account. So the idea here really, practically the bottom line is the same. But what happens is that either people are not linking a correction or a fact check to the myth in their memory network, and so people, the two are not linked, and so that's why it's not working, or there's a retrieval failure that, it is linked, but people fail to retrieve the correction when they access the myth in their memory network. And so that typically happens because the myth is more prominent relative to the correction. How does something become more prominent? The more often it's repeated, the more likely your brain is to mistake familiarity for truth. So, repeating something a lot makes it more fluent in the brain. This is a process called fluency. 2 + 2 is 4. You know that because you've heard it 100 times. You don't have to think about it, so it becomes very fluent. But a side effect of that is that the brain tends to mistake fluency for truth. And so the more prominent the myth is, the more you repeat it, the more likely people are to think it's true, and the more dominance it gets in processing. And so it suppresses the correction, and people continue to rely on the myth. So generally, that's why we advise that if you debunk or fact check, you need to make the correction extremely prominent, and you need to minimize the amount of times that you repeat the myth, because otherwise you tend to not get the intended effect. So because of all of these reasons, it's difficult to debunk misinformation. So let me give you some real-world examples. So there's some research on Nazi indoctrination in Germany. So what they did is they looked at social surveys in the 90s and again in the 2000s, and they looked at the percent of, so they asked people, okay, well, do you think Jewish people caused their own persecution? Do you think they have a right to live in Germany? Do you think they made up the Holocaust, things like that? So people who strongly subscribe to anti-Semitism is on the y-axis, and then birth decade is on the x-axis. So controlling for lots of things like people's education, their gender, their socioeconomic status, you see that people who were born during the Nazi regime or the propaganda period are much more likely to have anti-Semitic beliefs than people who were born after. And this is partly because of the continued influence of being exposed to propaganda for a very long time. You see this with the Iraq War too. So this was very prevalent in the United States. And the tricky thing here is that it's not just crazy outlets. So the New York Times played a major role in misinformation about the Iraq War. So it kept printing articles that were suggestive that weapons of mass destruction had been found, while in fact they hadn't been found. And so what would happen is that they would say, oh, there may be weapons of mass destruction in this location. And then 2 weeks later they would say, never mind, this didn't happen. And ultimately what that created, and a lot of research shows that, is that people continue to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction found during the war. The New York Times, they issued an apology in 2004. Some of the things they said was, we consider the story of Iraq's weapons and the patterns of misinformation to be unfinished business because they recognized they were duped and printed lots of false stories. So it's not just marginalized outlets, it can be mainstream outlets as well. So for all of these reasons, we want to pre-bunk instead of debunk, and that's kind of the research that we're working on. And so what is pre-bunking? Pre-bunking is the opposite of debunking, where you try to preemptively build resilience. And how do you do that? We follow the vaccination metaphor exactly. So there's a social psychologist named Bill McGuire, who in the 60s came up with this idea, and he printed this article called A Vaccine for Brainwash, And he had a fascinating idea. He never really tested it, and so that's kind of where we picked it up. But I think the idea was brilliant. His idea was, at the time, he was kind of fascinated by the Korean War at the time. And it's also called sometimes the Forgotten War in the United States because it didn't get as much attention as the Vietnam War. But basically what happened was that I think one British national and 19 US nationals voluntarily stayed behind in what was then communist China. And so the US, they thought, oh, they had been brainwashed by foreign troops. We need a vaccine against brainwashing, against foreign propaganda. That was the idea. It later turns out that these soldiers actually stayed behind for different reasons. Some of them, know that there was a lot of racism happening in the United States. Some of them just wanted to explore socialism a bit more. So, people debate over whether they were actually quote-unquote brainwashed. But I think that the idea is that Maguire didn't know this at the time. All he knew was that the government was basically saying that all of these soldiers are not coming home to the United States and they're vulnerable to what they consider to be foreign propaganda. So Bob Cialdini, who's a big norms researcher, has this quote that if it happens in your country, we call it education, but when another country does it, it's disinformation or propaganda. I think that's kind of true, right? If you look at, and we work with a lot of governments, and so whenever we work with the government, whatever public education campaign they do nationally is always considered, public education, but then what other countries are doing is propaganda. And so I don't want to make any value judgments here, but the basic idea is that they wanted the solution to be that, okay, people should know more about America, they should know more about why capitalism is so great, about the core values of our society, then they won't be so vulnerable to, the communism propaganda. And what Maguire said at the time was, actually, no, I don't think people need that at all. I think what people need is a weakened dose of the types of attacks that they might be facing on their belief systems. Because the issue is that people have no mental defenses. They're caught off guard, they've never rehearsed these arguments before, and they become persuaded over time. And so they don't need more facts. What they need is a weakened simulation of the types of challenges that they might be facing. And so he did some lab experiments on this with things like toothbrushing. And so what he would do is he would have students come in, and then he would basically ask them to write an essay on whether or not too much toothbrushing can cause cavities. And so he figured, everybody agrees that toothbrushing is a good thing. And so people have probably never been attacked on the idea that too much toothbrushing can cause cavities. That's not true, it's misinformation. But he thought, people probably have no mental defenses, so let me test this idea. And he found some initial evidence for this idea, that actually if you just give people facts about toothbrushing, that does very little. But if you prepare them for the types of misinformation that they might be facing, they become inoculated. And so then he stopped working on it altogether, and it's kind of a mystery why. He kind of left this research behind. So we pick up on the idea about 10 years ago. We started sort of researching this idea further, and it kind of extended this. He kind of used the analogy, but there's lots of ways in which it can be extended, and there were a lot of unanswered questions, and so we kind of picked up there. So what is inoculation theory? So just as a vaccine injects you with a weakened dose or an inactivated strain of a virus to help confer resistance against future infection by triggering the production of antibodies, you can do the same with information. By preemptively exposing people to a weakened dose or weakened strain of misinformation, or the techniques that are used to spread misinformation, people can build up these mental antibodies over time. The psychological aspect has two bases, what we call an affective and a cognitive basis. So the affective basis is that, we know from lots of experiments, people generally don't pay attention, so they need to have the perception that they're vulnerable to misinformation to sort of jumpstart the psychological immune system. So we want people to start counter-arguing. These are the mental antigens that people need to have a feeling of internal resistance, right? They need to recognize they might be under attack, and they need to kick into gear their defenses. Then the cognitive basis is what we call the refutational preemption. So you preemptively refute future falsehoods. That's the pre-bunk. So we've relabeled that pre-bunking because it's easier to understand. And then over time, people can build up resistance. Now, I won't go through all of this because we don't have the time today. I want to show you some more fun experiments we did later on. But when we first did this, it kind of hit the news, and people say, oh, Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. It's possible to vaccinate Americans specifically. Because we did a study on climate change denial in the United States. That was kind of our first case study. I won't explain too much about this, but basically, there's a lot of disinformation about climate change in the United States. And one of the things we did was we had people either they would just receive some facts about climate change, or we'd inoculate them against this specific form of misinformation that they would be seeing in the future. So there's this petition that circulates on social media. It's part of this campaign from what I call the emergence of doubt. So this is a book from Naomi Oreskes, later made into a documentary film. It's really, really interesting. It talks about how the tobacco industry tried to mislead people on the link between smoking and cancer, and how the same techniques are used to cast doubt on fossil fuels, the relation between fossil fuels and climate change, acid rain. Some of the same actors who deny COVID and the link between vaccination and health use the same strategies. And the core strategy here is to cast doubt on the scientific consensus by using fake experts. And so you can see some of the tactics they use here. So this was an ad that was run by the tobacco industry called the white coat technique. So you dress people up in a doctor's coat, and you say, oh, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, to try to get people, on board. So what we did is we explained this to people in advance. We sort of said, okay, there's this technique called fake experts. Here's how they're used. You shouldn't fall for this technique. And then later people were exposed to misinformation about climate change, and we found that when you had inoculated people, they were less likely to fall prey to these sorts of misinformation tactics. And we did a bunch of experiments on that. But I was very specific to this one technique and to climate change. And the idea was really that what we found was that if you just exposed people to the misinformation, it really negatively impacted their attitudes on climate change. But if you had inoculated them beforehand, they were much more resistant. And if you sort of debunked it after the fact, it wasn't as effective. Now, these are older studies, so I want to take the time today to sort of get into the more recent research we've done on this. But if you're interested, we have lots of review papers where we discuss these lab studies in a lot of detail. So we've done a lot of these over the years. But that kind of led to a bigger idea. So it was this sort of idea, okay, well, if we can inoculate people against specific falsehoods, how can you scale this? How can you actually implement this in the wild? Because the problem with fact-checking is that it just doesn't scale. So it takes weeks to produce a fact-check. And they almost receive no social media engagement. If you look at the initial misinformation that goes viral, it accelerates rapidly, reaches millions of people, and then the fact check, comes 3 weeks after, when people have already been sort of fallen prey to the continued influence of misinformation. And so the idea here is to prevent this, but then if you pre-bunk a specific story, you can't pre-bunk every specific myth that's out there, right? So you have to scale it in some way. So here's where we took some inspiration from Severus Snape, who said your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. So we had a number of problems. First, getting students to come into the lab, read a 600-word pre-bunking essay, and then finding that they're more resistant is one thing. But in real life, people are not going to come into the lab and read a 600-word essay. And also, we can't pre-bunk every single story, right? And so we started brainstorming about what we could do to be more flexible and inventive with the way that we actually implement science. So one of the things is we created the first fake news game, which was called Bad News. Bad News was a joke at first, in the sense that we had created a social media simulation. And so this simulates a social media feed. It was extremely sarcastic. But the point of the game was actually to offer an environment, a simulated environment, in which people can expose themselves to weakened doses of the key techniques that are used in spreading misinformation and disinformation. So we spent about a year trying to uncover the quote-unquote the structure of the RNA virus here. So what are the underlying fingerprints, what are the instructions that encode most types of misinformation? And so we found that there's at least 6 of them that are really repetitive. And so we figured, well, maybe we could make this sort of broader spectrum vaccine, that if we vaccinate people against these broader techniques, then it doesn't matter what specific misinformation they come across. If it makes use of these tactics, they're going to be inoculated. And so here's Bad News. The way of Bad News, so John Rosenbeek, who's a postdoc in my lab, really created and programmed a lot of it. He was receiving a not-so-scientific question on CNN about the game, so you can see his amused expression there. But Bad News simulates a social media feed, so the goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing your credibility. So we launched this during the Trump era. After long deliberation with my generals, decided to declare war on North Korea, #Kim Jong-un. And so you tweet this and you get responses. This is not something Trump said, but could have said. And so all of the content is fictional because we wanted to rule out prior familiarity confounds and things like that. So you tweet this. Mainstream media has one massive conspiracy, hashtag fake news. You create your own echo chamber, your own filter bubble. People learn about these things. Here you're impersonating NASA. Meteorite alert, large space objects hit US West Coast, hashtag be safe. You're trending. So this is a part of a larger technique called impersonation, which is now widely debated with Elon Musk on Twitter, that people are impersonating and the whole sort of blue verification tick. So this is a major issue. So we manipulated the Twitter handle here. So it's an N instead of an M. So most participants failed to notice this on the pretest, but then once they've exposed themselves to weakened doses of these techniques and learn how to refute them, they become more resistant and are able to spot them on the post-test. Same with NASA. It has an umlaut here. So it's subtle, but it's manipulative. But it uses the logo, and that's all part of this impersonation strategy. Fake expert was the original. That's very common, but organizations and politicians are also impersonated, and so that's kind of the larger strategy. So it's interactive. So you tweet stuff, you get followers. If you're being too ridiculous, you lose all credibility because real producers of disinformation, they're not too outrageous. They try to be serious in spreading disinformation, and so you get reactions from people and so on. Here are the 6 techniques. We would call the 6 degrees of manipulation: polarizing audiences online, impersonating, including fake experts, conspiracy theories, trolling people, using emotions like fear-mongering about the virus and the vaccine, for example, to get people riled up, and discrediting others, basically saying you're fake news and discrediting fact-checkers in the mainstream media, kind of what Musk also does online, and Trump and other people. So these are very common strategies. And so you get your badge if you pass one of these levels, and then you move up, and at the end you get your Master of the Arts of Disinformation certificate. And so it was kind of edgy, right? It went viral on Reddit. People really liked it because we didn't brand it as some Cambridge, initiative trying to educate people about fake news. So it got organic, it got a lot of traffic. So this thing went viral, and then we had millions of participants going through this intervention, and so we could really evaluate it. And so that's what we've been doing. So again, all of the content's fake, but it's based on reality. So for example, somebody impersonated the billionaire Warren Buffett on Twitter using that technique. So there's a T missing here. But he tweeted out, this account got 200,000 followers in a matter of days, and he was just tweeting out nonsense like, ooh, invest in what makes you happy. And it wasn't real stuff. So that's where the Trump impersonation sort of came from. So we modeled it after real stuff so that it has external validity, but we wanted it to be fictional. A, because the ethics committee didn't want us to actually do people, and B, so we could exclude prior familiarity. So how do we evaluate this? So we did something very simple. I mean, in the game, you have a fake news quiz that people take voluntarily, and so we could get big data on how good people are at this. And so this is a story that's completely fake, made up, that uses this technique, but that's not the example that people saw in the game, right? So this is, if you follow the vaccine analogy, this is a new strain of the virus, right? Or a different variant of the same virus of impersonation. And so the idea is that with the vaccine, the more examples you can give the body of invading pathogens, the more effective it's going to be able at mounting a defense. And it's really the same with the mind. Like the more examples you can give people of what this technique looks like, the more resilient people are going to be. So it's a different example, right? This was during Game of Thrones years ago. I don't know if you guys follow Game of Thrones, but I was very disappointed by the ending. But the eighth season will be postponed. Total fake news. This wasn't the case, but it used the technique. This is Johnson Crude Oil trolling Leonardo DiCaprio about global warming. This is part of the trolling technique, and so on. So we got, initially when we did this, we had about 30,000 data points. So we had about 15,000 people in the first few months, so we could really look at a lot of data. So this is the pre-post, very simple experiment, just pre-post. So this is the real news ratings that people were shown, highly reliable before and after playing. And this is the fake news or the tweets that make use of one of these 6 disinformation strategies. So people find the tweets that use impersonation, conspiracy, deflection significantly less reliable after playing. These are the data distributions, so you can see that people find them less reliable. The density goes down after people play the game. So that was positive. If you split it out by education or liberal, conservative, it didn't really matter. So both liberals and conservatives learned from the game or were inoculated. People who are lower and higher educated. I mean, there's baseline differences where people start in terms of how susceptible they are, but everyone, the inoculation benefited most cross sections, which was really promising. So I had a student who is now graduated, Melissa, was a Gates student, who did a randomized replication. So we recognized some of these limitations, right? It was a within subject experiment, so we didn't have a proper control group. So we wanted to do a randomized experiment now. So the control group played Tetris. Some of the participants wrote to us saying, is this what Cambridge University has come to, asking people to play Tetris for 20 minutes? But yes, if you're in a placebo group, that's basically what people did. So we paid them to play Tetris for 20 minutes, just so we had a control group. Then we were also able to really increase the amount of items. And so it could be that in the game, right, if you're a bit skeptical, you could say, okay, well, the game, it slows down the engine when we ask people questions. And so, we can't have a big psychometric survey. And so you could say, okay, well, maybe these are, you just pick some easy items and people improve on them. So what we did here is we really created a large database of items, and we sort of repeated the experiment. So Melissa loves puns, and, she titled the paper Good News About Bad News. And so what we found, this is the average of the fake news reliability score, that people in the inoculation group found it on average significantly less reliable. So this is the density, so it goes to the left, which means less reliable. But Melissa had an interesting hypothesis. She also said, well, it's great if it helps people spot fake news, but what about how confident people are? So if you're not very confident in your own abilities, or if you're not very confident in what's true or false, you're easily persuaded. So what's interesting is that we also found that people became more confident in their truth discernment abilities after playing the game. So that was another sort of positive finding. Then Raccoon, who is also one of my PhD students, now a postdoc, replicated the experiment again, but he was interested in how long this lasts. So at this point, people were saying, okay, cool, you can vaccinate people, but to some extent at least, right? It's not full immunity. That's kind of where it differs with the biological vaccine, right? It's not 95% immunity, but his question was, how long does it last? And so you could say, well, it's great if it lasts for like, a couple hours, couple days, but eventually people are going to, go back to what they were doing before. So how long does this really last? So it was a good question. So we looked at the long-term effectiveness of this paradigm. So basically what we did, and I'm not going to go through each because it's the same experiment every time. So all of these experiments are like this. We give people a pretest, so a battery of the fake news items that we have. Then we randomize to the inoculation or control. We test them again. And then we started following up with people 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, all the way until the end, which was about 3 months. And so this in the inoculation framework, this is called attacks. It sounds a bit nefarious, but we basically expose people to misinformation again at every instant and see if they're still resilient. The second experiment, we cut out the intermediate testing, just follow up with people at the end. The third experiment, we changed the items at every testing interval. So there were some reviewers of our paper who said, maybe people are just remembering their answers. And I was like, okay, well, I can barely remember what I had for dinner yesterday, but let's assume people are remembering what they say to 21 different items, after a week. Let's just change the items every single time. So basically, here's what we find. So people find fake news less reliable after playing. So this is before playing, there's no difference. Then people find fake news, the average of, a battery of, let's say, 20 test items less reliable. And this maintained itself week after week after week. So I said to Raccoon, that's not possible. Even with the COVID vaccine, it wears off and people need boosters, right? So it would be fantastic psychologically if people are now forever immune, but that's obviously not possible. So we repeated the experiment, and this is the interesting part. When you cut out the intermediate engagement, that's where you do see decay of the effect. So, you can see here that people start finding fake news more reliable again over time. There's still a difference between treatment and control, so it's still working, but it's regressing. And that's more of the pattern we expected. And so what we learned from that is actually you can maintain the effect with boosters. So the sort of testing people week after week helps retrieve some of the lessons from memory that they've learned. It also boosts people's motivation to think about the threat of misinformation. So we're actually boosting people on a regular basis. And some later experiments we found that you can maintain this effect as long as you boost people. But without the booster, it does lose its effectiveness over time. Okay. So once we had a lot of evidence, we started talking to other sort of organizations. So the UK government became very interested in this, and so they helped translate bad news in pretty much every major language around the world. So you can play this game in most languages. And we did some large cross-cultural evaluations that we're able to do with the government. So some of the same results we had in Sweden, Germany, Greece, Poland. So we found that the game was, about equally effective. There's some small, between country variation. Then we did this thing for NATO, during the Ukraine war, where we were able to actually put out a handbook on how to pre-bunk during conflicts and how to implement this. One of the most interesting examples of pre-bunking actually came right before the war. So the U.S. government, who had been advising at the time of this approach, they were sitting on this intelligence that Putin was going to release fake videos portraying Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil. And normally the U.S. doesn't release that intelligence because it's highly sensitive. But they launched this massive pre-bunking campaign where they put out, and then shared it with the UK intelligence services as well, where they basically told people that they're going to be seeing fake videos, they're going to be a pretext for an invasion of eastern Ukraine, there's going to be very graphic propaganda, here's what these fake attacks looks like. And so they were actually inoculating. They used the warning, they used the preemptive example of what the attack is going to look like, they refuted it in advance. And basically what they claim, I don't have the data, they claim that it helped prevent polarization in NATO member states and that it might have even delayed the attack on Ukraine by a few days, which, for a social psychological intervention, that's pretty much as much as you can expect, I would say. So we have our game in Ukrainian and Russian, and so we're able to monitor and see how things are going. So these are real headlines. Russia targeting U.S. biological weapons labs in Ukraine. Actor Steven Seagal spotted among Russian special forces. This was total fake news. But again, we found that the game is effective. This was during the conflict. So we keep monitoring these interventions and see how we can help. We were in the London Design Museum for a while. Here you see one of our victims playing the game. It was a special Brexit version at the time. John, very well deserved, won some nice prizes for all his creativity in the games. We have a version for kids where the content's more appropriate. It's about SpongeBob and you're impersonating the high school principal. And you're saying school's out, which is fake news. And so it's the same lessons but more appropriate. And then the final few things I want to talk about is some of the more real-world applications that we've done. So during the pandemic, the government contacted us and they had this plan of how are we going to counter COVID. In fact, they had no plan. That was their plan. But they said we need to counter COVID disinformation. We're considering a plan. And we said basically, well, we need to pre-bunk and inoculate. We're pretty early in the pandemic at that stage. I think it was March 2020. Surprisingly, they came on board and they said, okay, let's do it. But the feedback was that bad news is a 15 to 20 minute simulation. We use it in education as well. It's more of a tool and a fun thing. But they said, on social media, you have 30 seconds to a few minutes with people. So we need a game that's much shorter and much more specific to the pandemic. So we created Go Viral. We did that with the United Nations and the World Health Organization, as well as the UK government. And so Go Viral is the same as bad news. It's only 5 minutes, and it focuses specifically on disinformation about the pandemic. So you're stepping into the shoes of Joel. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. He said, how I need a quarantini. Basically, he's uncovering evidence that eating kiwis actually cures the virus. But some actors kept it hidden, and so he joins a group called Not Co-Frayed. And so, it really escalates from there. There's a big TP shortage because everyone's buying the toilet paper, and they're blaming Big Pharma for destroying the rainforest. And so you have all these wild scenarios that are, completely made up, but modeled after real disinformation about the pandemic. So we have fake experts. This was huge during the pandemic. People impersonating doctors, health practitioners. Then we had conspiracy theories like the whole Gates vaccine thing, 5G, as well as fear-mongering, which was also important. So here's Joel in the Not Co-Frayed group. University of Camford expert. Lizard people are behind coronavirus. Live virus particles found in terrariums. And so it's meant to be funny and a weakened dose, right? We're trying to completely neutralize it so that people are not actually duped, but they familiarize themselves with these tactics. So how do we evaluate these things? So we have our in the wild interventions, right? These are the pre-post studies with our games, and then we do these pre-registered RCTs as well. And one additional hypothesis we had here was that we wanted to compare this, what we call active inoculation, which is that you actively create your own content, and compare that to passive inoculation. So passive inoculation is when I give you the counter arguments or the weakened dose, and you commit it to memory or you rehearse it, right? But we hypothesized that it's going to be much more effective if people generate their own antibodies because we feel more agency over our own ideas, we're more likely to remember it, we're more motivated. So we wanted to, that's why our simulations are a choose your own adventure game where people can actively create their own weakened doses. So we wanted to compare that. And then do our surveys. We ran trials in France, UK, and Germany. And people would be confronted with this sort of stuff. Nobel laureate professor claims that the virus is not natural. There's evidence suggesting it is man-made. And then we ask people how manipulative they find this post before and after playing. So this is the fake expert technique again. And so here you see in the game that people find fake news overall more manipulative after playing, and they're better able to recognize fake experts, emotion, and conspiracy. These are credible news items, just boring facts, and you see people don't really shift their ratings on that. We just want to monitor that as well. And then this is the randomized sort of study where, interestingly, what you see here is that the Go Viral game has a higher effect size than the infographics. So the UN was running its own pre-bunking campaign using infographics, but they're not interactive, right? So they worked compared to the control group as well, as you can see here, but they were not as effective as the game, and so that really plays into that active element. And in fact, we find that people who played the game are more motivated than people who went through some of the other interventions, and they were more willing to share the inoculation with others. And that's kind of the final thing that I want to talk about, is the importance of sharing the inoculation. So we did the same with the US government with CISA, which is in charge of election integrity. So during the previous election, we ran a game called Harmony Square, which is about how to spot foreign influence techniques during elections. It's different, so now you have a newscaster and people can see how the elections being manipulated in real time by floating disinformation. Chris Krebs, who was fired by Trump because he kept debunking Trump's election-related claims, that it was stolen, dead people voting, that there was the fraud, right? And so Chris was the head of CSAT Homeland Security, who kept saying that the election was fair and due process was followed. So we worked for Chris, and then he got fired. Luckily, they still implemented our game. It's based on the pineapple pizza metaphor, which kind of illustrates foreign influence techniques using the idea of putting pineapple on pizza. And so the story goes that it's offensive to Italians to put pineapple on pizza, but some people really like it, and so you can get a debate started and scapegoat different groups based on whether or not they're putting pineapple on pizza, and then you buy bots and amplify the debate, and that's how you sow societal divisions. So that's kind of what our game does too. And so here you're floating Plug. Ashley Plug is running for the sort of town mayor position, but then you start floating disinformation that she's abused animals in college, and you say, I think Plug's animal abuse is unbearable. And so it's kind of this sort of stuff, again, the weekend dose. But then we expose people to the really polarizing stuff. Fathers don't deserve a day, and Father's Day. South Carolina man and his 9-year-old daughter out hunting were killed by a fellow hunter who mistook them for a deer. This really happened. But then somebody commented, 1.5 less MAGA Billies in the world. At least they died supporting their beloved Second Amendment. And so, this really polarizing stuff. So these were our test items. And again, we find that people play our game, find this stuff less reliable. They're more confident in their judgments, and they're less willing to share it. John was at the UN. With Cass Sunstein, who works on this idea of nudge, trying to implement this at a larger scale. We started to do computational models to see how we can spread the inoculation in network structures. And the last question that I'll talk about is really the final step that we're working towards is really the idea of spreading the inoculation and how we can scale it. Because just as with the regular vaccines, it's useful if people vaccinate themselves, but the whole idea is herd immunity, right? If enough people are vaccinated, then the virus can no longer effectively spread. And it's really the same with the idea of misinformation. So we teamed up with Google, and Google said, this is really cool, we need to implement this. But even on social media, it still needs to be shorter. They said, okay, 5-minute game, on social media, what we know from our data on YouTube and other platforms that we own, that's just too long. You have about 1.5 minutes, let's say, on YouTube with people, so we need something that's 1 minute or 30 seconds, and we decided to do videos. Videos are interesting. They're not as interactive as our games, but you can scale them a bit better. Turns out not everyone wants to play a game. We were surprised, but if we wanted to reach more people, we needed to have a bigger virtual needle. And so the idea was that we do the same thing with the videos. So we say that users are alerted to a manipulation attack. Then we give them a weekend dose of something like scapegoating minority groups, and then they get examples or the microdose of what that looks like, and then see if they become more resistant. And so we have a website called inoculation.science. You can see all of our videos, games, and studies there if people are interested in the sort of practical consequences of it. But the last study we did, and this was most recent, was we did 6 experiments trying to evaluate this approach on YouTube. And here, it's interesting because on YouTube, there's no news on YouTube, right? There's no news headlines. But the problem with YouTube is that there's a lot of political people on there that use rhetoric to radicalize people into more extremist modes of thinking, and they use rhetorical techniques or strategies for political purposes, including, false dichotomies, so presenting people with 2 options or pretending that there's only 2 options. Examples that YouTube gave us were often from ISIS or jihad, where they say, oh, you either join ISIS or you're not a good Muslim or something like that. But you see it with Western political examples too, scapegoating, like, oh, the Chinese virus or something like that. Ad hominem attacks and manipulative emotional language. And so those are very common on YouTube, and we try to inoculate people against these techniques. I'm not sure if you can see the video. So the videos are they're 30 seconds now, but we started out with 1 minute and 30 seconds, or a control group, a video about freezer burn, very exciting. And then people got a post-test where we give them some of these items and we ask them and see how they're doing. So these items are things like, let's see, they're not where I thought I put them. So the examples are like, wow. So the examples of these items are things like, oh, we need to address the homelessness problem in America instead of paying money to immigrants. Which again is a false dichotomy, right? You can both address the social funding for immigrants and the homelessness problem at the same time. And so we had manipulative tweets like that and a neutral version of the same tweet. And so other examples would be, there was one about politicians that was basically saying that they're parasites and they don't contribute anything to society. And so, although we might feel that way sometimes, it's a form of scapegoating a particular group in society. So here's an example of the video. So Google, it's interesting. So these social media companies, they don't want to give people a weekend dose that's too controversial, and they don't want to touch on any actual issue. And so we needed to find a way to deliver the inactivated dose using a humorous example that has no chance of either being controversial or duping people in some way. So I think we used a clip from Star Wars, and so it starts off like this. Hopefully it works. Let's see.
Either you stop watching the mainstream media, or you want all puppies to die. Makes sense, right? No? Good, because it shouldn't. It's a common manipulation technique called a false dichotomy, or a false dilemma. It's designed to make you think you only got 2 choices to choose from, when in reality, there are more. As with our little dilemma at the beginning, there's no reason why you can't watch mainstream media and want all puppies to live. The 2 don't rule each other out. And by presenting you with an option that is clearly undesirable, and the option the manipulator wants you to pick, your choices are narrowed down for you. A famous example of a false dilemma is this one, from Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
My allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy! If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Anakin's claim that Obi-Wan...
So it goes on like that. Google questioned our Star Wars humor, but we overall it got good engagement. We did some focus groups though with people, and they wondered, oh, they showed a clip from Star Wars. These people must be really old. And so there are some audiences for which we've changed the example. Yeah, I mean, I think these were millennials.
That was the third. That came out in 2000 what?
Yeah, well, which is 20 years ago now, I guess. And so, yeah, the real young, the TikTok generation didn't take too kindly to our use of Star Wars or Family Guy or any of the examples from the early 2000s and 90s. So we have different versions, but you get the idea, right? I'm sure you're thinking, I'm a Cambridge student, I obviously wouldn't fall for that stuff. But what's interesting is that a lot of these techniques are used very quickly in late night shows on YouTube, and at first people think, oh yeah, that sounds reasonable, but then the more you think about it, it's like, actually that's a logical fallacy. And so we try to inoculate people against that sort of stuff. And mostly what we found was this is discernment. So this is people score fake minus real, and so better discernment is good here. So you see that people are better at recognizing all of these techniques. They become more confident. and they're less willing to share. Most of them, it didn't work for every single one of them, but for most of them, people are less willing to share this type of content. But the final question that we got throughout this whole presentation I gave you is that does this actually work on social media? Because that is the kind of the million-dollar question. So we got YouTube. Well, actually, YouTube didn't particularly want to participate at that time, but Google owns YouTube, and so they were able to mediate and find a way to actually do this. So you know the ad space on YouTube? You expose this annoying ad you can't skip. So we were able to insert our pre-bunking videos in those ad spaces and actually expose people preemptively to the pre-bunk. Then within 24 hours, people were exposed to one of these surveys on YouTube. They're usually used by corporations to poll people's brand recognition, but we kind of hijacked that system for scientific purposes to see if people could identify the technique that was being used in the item, or a control group about cooking rice, I think. And so they allowed us to, out of the 1 million people that were exposed to this video, they allowed us to randomly select 30% for this test. And what we found, so here you have the ad and then it sort of counts down and then you get the survey. So this was in the wild when people are distracted and actually on YouTube, is that the effects are much smaller than what we see in the lab. But overall, we boosted people's ability to sort of detect these techniques by about 5%. It may seem small compared to some of these lab findings, but if you're a company and you're spending millions on advertising, what you usually get with these ads is a 0.1% increase in name recognition or a 1% increase in name recognition. And so, to YouTube, this was a really big effect in terms of what they usually see, what advertisers can achieve. So if we can achieve this for educational purposes, I think we saw that as a win. So YouTube is rolling this out. There was an article in the New York Times that Google is now rolling this out wide scale. They have a really cool example currently active on the Ukraine-European refugee debate. So here, and I like how they did this, here they have people talking at a table, and basically they're acting out the inoculation. So they're kind of saying, oh, you might see this narrative that all of these people from Ukraine are now coming to Europe and they're going to steal our jobs and things like that. However, that's misinformation because so and so. And then they sort of question, but is it really? And then it's like, yeah, this is a strategy that's used, and so they sort of act out the inoculation so people at home can sort of model it. So that's been a really interesting campaign that they're currently evaluating. So millions of people are currently being inoculated, and we're doing this with various issues, various campaigns with various social media companies, and sort of continuing to evaluate this approach. My own propaganda is that I have a book forthcoming where you can find all of this stuff, which will be part of the PBS 7 reading, so it'll be available in the library anyway. But yeah, thanks for listening. I hope it was useful.